The letter is written on thin, almost translucent paper. The ink, a deep, somber blue. The handwriting is careful, precise, the strokes of a young man taught to value order and discipline. He writes to his mother, telling her not to worry, that the cherry blossoms near the base are beautiful, and that he is proud to serve the emperor. It's late 1944. He is 17 years old. In less than a year, he will be gone. This isn't a story about monsters or fanatics. It's a story about boys. Boys who loved their families, dreamed of going to university, and wrote poetry in secret notebooks. So how did it come to this? How did a modern, sophisticated nation, in the final, desperate year of a losing war, convince its brightest and best that the ultimate purpose of life was to end it in a blaze of suicidal glory? This is the question at the heart of the Tokubetsu, the Special Attack Units, a name that would later be sensationalized by the West as Kamikaze. By late 1944, the Japanese Empire was crumbling. The defensive perimeter across the Pacific had been shattered. American B-29 bombers were flying from newly captured islands, raining fire on Japanese cities with terrifying impunity. The once mighty Imperial Navy was crippled, its carriers at the bottom of the sea, its fuel reserves nearly empty. The war machine was starving. For Japan's leadership, trapped in a corner of their own making, there seemed to be only one weapon left: human will. They called it the Special Attack, a strategy born of desperation, where pilots would guide their bomb-laden aircraft directly into enemy warships. A one-way mission. To find the men for these missions, they didn't look to their veteran pilots. Those were too valuable, too few. Instead, they turned to the youth. They turned to the schools. Across the country, a system was already in place, designed to mold boys into soldiers from a young age. Programs like the Naval Preparatory Flight Training known as the Yokaren had been grooming teenagers for aviation careers for years. Army schools like Kamikaze and Okinawa accelerated their training, and a nationwide mobilization pulled students, some as young as 16, directly from their classrooms and into uniform. This pipeline wasn't just about technical training. It was built on a foundation of decades of indoctrination. The Imperial Rescript on Education, a document read aloud in every school, demanded absolute loyalty to the emperor and the state. It was coupled with something called seishin kyōiku, or spiritual training. This wasn't about religion in the Western sense. It was about forging a spirit of self-sacrifice, endurance, and unquestioning obedience. It taught that the individual was nothing, and the nation was everything. To die for the emperor wasn't a tragedy. It was the purest, most honorable act a Japanese man could perform. Virtue was obedience. Life was service. Death was fulfillment. Let's call him Kenji. He isn't one single person, but a composite. His voice drawn from the real letters and diaries left behind by thousands. Before the war, Kenji loved reading Western philosophy and listening to jazz records with his friends. He argued with his father about his future and promised his little sister he'd take her to the city to see the new department stores. He was, in every way, an ordinary teenager with ordinary dreams. The propaganda posters showed heroic pilots, draped in white scarves, ascending to become guardian spirits of the nation. They promised honor, glory, a beautiful death that would live for eternity. But the reality at the training bases was anything but glorious. The food was scarce watery soup and a few grains of rice. The training aircraft were often old and poorly maintained. The barracks were cold and drafty. The discipline was brutal, with beatings for the smallest infractions, designed to break the individual ego and instill instant, reflexive obedience. The promise of honor was a distant echo in a world of hunger, exhaustion, and fear. Yet, amidst this grim reality, the spiritual training continued relentlessly. They were told they were more than pilots. They were human bullets, the last divine wind that would save Japan from annihilation. And then the day comes. An officer enters the barracks, a stack of papers in his hand. He calls out names. Kenji hears He's handed a small form. It's not an order. It says, "I request for volunteers." But everyone knows there is no choice. To refuse would be to disgrace your family, to brand yourself a coward for life. It is an illusion of choice, the final turn of the screw in a long process of psychological conditioning. His hand trembles, just slightly as he holds the pen. Outside, the wind rustles the pine trees. In the distance, a train whistle blows a lonely, mournful sound. It's the sound of a journey beginning. A train that will carry him and the other boys toward a dusty coastal airfield. A place where their training will intensify, focusing not just on how to fly an airplane, but on how to truly, deeply believe in the necessity of dying in one. The gates close behind you. There's no ceremony, no grand speech, just the harsh scrape of metal on concrete. Induction is a blur of razors and rough hands. Hair falls to the floor, taking names and past lives with it. You're handed a uniform that smells of mothballs and someone else's sweat. Oaths are shouted, the words echoing promises you barely understand. Your personal belongings are collected in a rough burlap sack, letters from home, a photograph, a small charm. They are now contraband, distractions from the singular purpose that awaits you. This isn't a school, it's a crucible. Your new life is measured by the rising sun. Before its first rays break the horizon, you're running. The cold morning air bites at your lungs, your bare feet pounding the frozen earth. Chants ripple through the group, a rhythmic pulse of devotion. Duty is heavier than a mountain. Death is lighter than a feather. This is seishin kyōiku, spirit training. In crowded lecture halls, instructors drill into you the emperor's divinity. He is a living god, and you are his willing instruments. Your destiny is not your own. It is to serve, to obey, to become a seamless part of the nation's will. Hesitation is not just a mistake, it's a moral failure. A moment's doubt is met with the sharp sting of a wooden stick across your back. A lesson learned more through muscle than mind. The days bleed into one another, a relentless cadence of theory and practice. Ground school is a world of silhouettes flashed on a screen for a fraction of a second. Grumman F6F Hellcat. You shout. Vought F4U Corsair. You trace flight paths on worn-out maps, learning the rudiments of navigation by stars you may never see. You spend hours in mock cockpits, wooden shells that mimic the real thing, practicing movements until they are pure instinct. The air is thick with the scent of old wood, sweat, and the faint tantalizing smell of aviation fuel that always seems just out of reach. Reality, however, is a constant, nagging shortage. Fuel is more precious than blood. The worn-out Type 93 trainers, affectionately and ironically nicknamed Akatambo or red dragonflies, are relics. Their fabric wings are patched, their engines prone to sputtering coughs. Most of your flight time is spent on the ground, taxiing back and forth across the dusty airfield, learning to handle the controls without ever leaving the earth. The rattle of your mess tin at mealtime is a hollow sound, a reminder of the meager rations that fuel your exhausted body. You can see the conflict in the eyes of the older instructors. Men who once flew with grace and precision now preach the supremacy of spirit over skill. They know that courage alone cannot dodge anti-aircraft fire, that sheer will cannot outclimb a superior enemy fighter, but they have no choice. They teach what they can, their faces etched with a grim resignation. Accidents are frequent, a constant specter haunting the training fields. A plume of black smoke on the horizon is a common sight. Another trainee, another red dragonfly. Gone. You learn not to ask their names. Late one night, by the dim light of a smuggled candle, you scrawl in a hidden diary. Flew for 7 minutes today. The ground looked so small. Am I worthy of this honor, or am I just afraid? The shame and pride are a knot in your stomach, a constant churning battle within the mind of a 17-year-old boy. You wrap a greasy rag around the propeller of a grounded plane. The cold metal a solid, reassuring presence under your hand, a connection to the sky you so desperately crave. Then, a ripple of news arrives, spreading through the barracks like wildfire. Whispers from the Philippines. Special attack successes. The words are electric. Suddenly, the training shifts. The lectures on philosophy become shorter, the drills more intense, more frantic. The time for theory is over. A new word begins to circulate, spoken in hushed tones in the darkness of the barracks. It's a word that hangs in the air, heavy with meaning, feeling like both a promise and a death sentence. Asterisk TAK. Special attack. The path forward becomes terrifyingly clear. The question of why hangs heavy over this story, and the answer is far more complex than simple fanaticism. It begins not with a roar, but with a piece of paper. Imagine being a young cadet, barely out of your teens, handed a consent form. It has 3 simple boxes. I volunteer with all my heart. I volunteer. And I do not volunteer. As you hold the pen, your teacher or a superior officer stands nearby. Their presence isn't threatening, but it's a weight. You hear speeches echoing in your mind, comparing a young life to a cherry blossom most beautiful at its peak, just before it falls. To tick "I do not volunteer" was, in that moment, unthinkable. It meant more than just self-preservation. It was seen as a betrayal of your friends, your family, your nation. One cadet, reflecting on this choice, wrote in his diary, "I couldn't imagine facing my classmates if I didn't check yes." The social pressure was an invisible current, pulling everyone in the same direction. It wasn't a command from above, but a silent agreement from all around. And so, pen after pen scratched a check mark, sealing a fate presented as a choice. Once the volunteers were selected, their training began, and it was a world of stark contrasts. The technical side was brutally efficient, pared down to only the absolute essentials. There was no need to teach them how to land. Their education focused on the psychological. Hours were spent studying the silhouettes of enemy ships until they were burned into memory. They practiced maintaining unwavering concentration under immense stress, learning to fly straight and true through a storm of anti-aircraft fire. The goal wasn't to create master pilots, but to forge an unstoppable human projectile. The technique was minimal. The drilling of the spirit was absolute. As the training progressed, farewell rituals began to take shape, casting long shadows on the edges of the airfields. These weren't grand state ceremonies, but deeply personal acts. Young men would be photographed in their crisp new uniforms, a final portrait for their families. Mothers, sisters, and local women would sew senenbari, or thousand-stitch belts, each stitch a prayer for strength and protection. Before a mission, they would tie on hachimaki headbands, often inscribed with slogans or a rising sun. Each of these items, the photo, the belt, the headband, became a powerful symbol. They were threads of love and duty, tying the pilot to their mission, making the thought of turning back even more difficult. Amidst this grim preparation, small pockets of humanity persisted. Near the Chiran airbase, a woman named Tong Torahama ran a small café. The young pilots flocked there, and she treated them not as soldiers, but as her own sons. She listened to their fears, their hopes, and the songs they wanted to sing one last time. In her small café, they could, for a fleeting moment, be boys again, finding warmth and a motherly presence in the face of their fatalistic duty. She became a keeper of their stories, a humane witness to their final days. But the reality of their situation was never far away. The pervasive shortages and mechanical failures that plagued the Japanese war effort were a constant, grim companion. A training flight would end abruptly with an engine fire, the trainer plane sputtering back to Earth in a cloud of smoke. Instructors, themselves veterans of countless battles, would sometimes return from a training exercise with a haunted, empty stare after a cadet's fatal crash. The line between preparation and pointless waste was terrifyingly thin. Every successful takeoff felt like a minor miracle. Every mechanical failure, a reminder of the fragile machinery they were entrusting with their final act. And then one evening, the lists would go up. A slate of names posted on a wall at the command post. The moment every pilot both anticipated and dreaded. Our composite character, let's call him Kenji, walks towards the board. The air is thick with a nervous silence. He scans the neat columns of characters, his heart pounding in his chest, and then he sees it, his own name. He holds his breath, the world narrowing to that single point. Later, back in his barracks, he picks up his pen to write one last letter home. A final sentence that remains unfinished, hanging in the air. The air in Kyushu grew thick, heavy with something more than just the coming summer humidity. It was the week of final orders. The tension wasn't in the thunder of distant American guns, though we heard them, a constant, dull rumble from the direction of Okinawa. It wasn't even in the ash that sometimes rained down from the sky, a ghostly gray reminder of the B-29s flying high above. No, the tension was inside our barracks, in the silence between our breaths. They threw a victory banquet for us. The food was meager, but the sake flowed. An officer handed me a chipped porcelain cup, the liquid inside tasting bitter and strange on my tongue. "For the Emperor," he said, his voice a little too loud. We toasted, our voices a ragged chorus. Later, we posed for photographs, forcing smiles that felt like masks. "Tell your mother you are well and in high spirits," the photographer instructed. So I did. I wrote a polite lie, folded it carefully, and sent it home, knowing it would be the last letter she would ever receive from me. I tried to write another letter, one just for myself. I followed the conventions we'd been taught. Gratitude to my parents for raising me. An apology for not being a better son, a plea for my older brother to look after our younger siblings. I wrote and rewrote the lines, the ink blurring on the cheap paper. But at the end, A single unwritten thought hung in the air, a question I couldn't bring myself to form. Asterisk why? Asterisk, I quickly crumpled the paper and hid it away. Doubt was a disease, and the squad leaders were the physicians, their eyes constantly scanning for any sign of infection, any waver in our resolve. We will meet again at Yasukuni Shrine, a boy from the next bunk whispered to me one night, his voice filled with a desperate certainty. We were all clinging to that promise, the idea that our spirits would become guardians of the nation. The instructors reinforced it every day. Spirit conquers steel. They would shout, their faces red with conviction, one plane for one warship. We chanted it back until our throats were raw, trying to make ourselves believe that our will alone could sink an aircraft carrier. We moved through a series of staging fields, names that became a litany on our lips. Kanoya, Kushira, and finally, Chiran. Each base was a step closer. The runways here were different. They didn't loop back. They just pointed straight out over the cliffs to the endless gray of the sea. Chiran was known as the town of brave mothers, where local women had adopted us, mending our uniforms, bringing us small treats, and waving us off with tears in their eyes. Their kindness was a strange and painful comfort. Our world had shrunk to the confines of the airbase, to the cockpit of a Zero fighter packed with explosives. The grand strategies of the war, the movements of armies, the politics of Tokyo, all of it faded into an irrelevant haze. All that mattered was the wind, the weather reports, the mechanics' hurried checks. Fate was a capricious master. A mission would be scrubbed due to a sudden storm. An engine would fail its final test. One day my name was on the list. The next it was gone, erased, and replaced by another. I felt a confusing mix of relief and shame. Yesterday, waiting for a maintenance check, another pilot, Tanaka, wordlessly broke a tangerine in half and handed a piece to me. It was small and impossibly sweet. We sat on the wing of his plane, just for a moment, looking past the runway to the green, misty mountains in the distance. We didn't speak. We just ate the fruit and watched the clouds. In that stolen moment of quiet, of ordinary life, the immense weight of what we were about to do crashed down on me more than any lecture or slogan ever could. The taste of that tangerine. That's what I was leaving behind. Now it is dawn. The sky is a pale, bruised purple. My name is on the list again, and this time, there are no storms, no engine failures. The mechanics give a final thumbs up. I climb into the cockpit. The squad leader helps me tie the white asterisk, hachimaki asterisk, around my forehead and drapes the silk scarf, a gift from a schoolgirl, around my neck. He gives my shoulder a firm squeeze, his eyes meeting mine for a fraction of a second. I see no pity there, only a shared terrible understanding. The order comes. One by one, the engines roar to life, a deafening symphony of impending sacrifice. The plane shudders as I push the throttle forward. The ground rushes by, a blur of dirt and grass. Then, a sudden lightness. The wheels leave the earth. Below me, the cliffs of Kyushu fall away, and there is nothing but the sea stretching out to meet the horizon. The target is out there. I take a breath, the air cold and thin in my lungs. The engine's hum climbs, a physical thing that vibrates through the floor, up the seat, and into a gloved hand resting on the throttle. For a moment, it's just noise and vibration, a world contained within a cramped cockpit. Then the ground falls away. Below, the patchwork of the homeland shrinks, becoming an abstract map of greens and browns. The tremor in the hand isn't from the engine anymore. It's the echo of 1,000 drills, 1,000 shouts, a system designed to forge a single purpose. An instructor's voice, sharp and unforgiving. Your lives are lighter than a feather, but your duty is heavier than a mountain. The words, once a powerful mantra, now just hang in the air, thin and hollow. Another memory surfaces, softer this time. A mother's hands, deftly stitching a 1,000-stitch belt, a senenbari, each not a prayer for return. A promise he knew even then she was making to herself, not to him. The system used boys as fuel, and the fire was burning low. Suddenly the clouds part. The sea unfurls below, a vast, indifferent sheet of wrinkled blue-gray. It's hypnotic, serene. Time seems to stretch and slow. Then a speck. Then another. They grow, resolving into the hard geometric shapes of warships. On one of those decks, a different reality unfolds. A sailor's sharp cry, the jarring clang of an alarm bell, a shouted command lost to the wind and the immensity of the ocean. There's no glory here, just two sides of the same terrible equation, a shared cost measured in heartbeats. This is where the story often ends in Nith, with a fiery impact and a bonsai charge. But history is rarely so neat. The truth is, for so many, the mission ended differently. Some, lost in the vastness of the Pacific, their fuel gauges dropping to zero over an empty horizon. Others, downed by mechanical failure in planes built with desperate haste. Many were intercepted long before they ever saw a target, their final moments a frantic, one-sided duel against superior aircraft. Thousands perished, their sacrifice achieving little more than a grim tally in a war of attrition. Their stories didn't end in a blaze of strategic victory, but in the quiet, lonely embrace of the sea. Back home, the aftermath is a study in silence. In a barracks, a bed remains perfectly folded, a ghost of military discipline. A café owner washes a cup that will never be claimed again, its owner now just a fading memory. In a quiet home, a family receives a small, empty wooden box, a formal notice that their son, their brother, is gone. A life distilled into a piece of paper and an aching void where a person used to be. The war machine moved on, but these silences lingered, deep and permanent. The few who survived, those who returned due to weather or mechanical trouble, carried a different burden. They wrestled with a profound guilt, the haunting question of why them? Why were they spared when their comrades were not? Some of these survivors would later speak out, compelled to testify to the truth of their experience. They wanted the world to know the reality behind the propaganda that the majority of these special attack pilots were not fanatical volunteers, but teenagers, barely out of school, caught in a web of indoctrination, coercion, and a desperate failing strategy. They weren't gods or demons. They were young men, sacrificed by a nation in its death throes. At museums like the Chiran Peace Museum for Kamikaze pilots, you can still read their final letters. They are not grand manifestos of imperial glory. They are letters of love to their mothers, apologies for not being better sons, and quiet hopes for their younger siblings' futures. They reveal the humanity that the uniform and the mission try to erase. Our duty, as the living, is not to romanticize their end, but to understand the manipulation that made self-destruction seem like the noblest path. It's to recognize the human faces behind the myth. Thank you for joining me on this journey into a difficult and complex part of history. If you believe these untold stories matter, please consider subscribing. We'll continue to explore the past, not to find easy heroes or villains, but to honor the complex truth.